For the benefit of those who might not know Mr. Heblica well, Mr. Heblica retired as the Special Secretary in the Government of India in September 2010 after more than 38 years of service. He was decorated for meritorious service and distinguished service by the Government of India. He is currently managing trustee at the Institute of Contemporary Studies in Bangalore, with whom we've had several programs. He is also associated with corporate entities and others in an advisory capacity and also on cyber security related matters. Mr. Heblica keeps himself engaged with several universities, both in India and abroad, again on national security related issues. He's a former visiting professor at Manipal University and adjunct fellow at the International Strategic and Security Studies Program, National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. He, of course, writes regularly on national security related issues for several journals and magazines. Over to you, sir.
Oh, thank you, Shashi. Good morning once again to everybody. I have an interesting plenary session. I had a theme. I have four eminent speakers, and I will introduce them. I would just like to mention a few things that we will do before we get on to the discussion. I will introduce the panelists, then they will go by the way it is being planned. Thirdly, we'll have a question answer session in the end so that we have adequate time to discuss in the Q&A things that have not happened in the presentations. I would like to first welcome my dear friend Madhav Narapat to the webinar. He has been a very, very dear friend of mine for the last 15-20 years, and I have learned much about China, Taiwan, and about the Middle East and the Gulf from him. And he's been a good mentor in understanding what and how to understand China and India's relationship with Taiwan. To that extent, I think his being here today is something which I deeply appreciate. Thank you, Monu, for being with us. Apart from his involvement with the Manipal University and also the head of the Manipal Advisory Research Group, he is also the editorial director of ITV Network and the Sunday Guardian. We see him regularly on the TV and on a network that is more strident, as we say, on matters of India's security and foreign relations. And the next speaker would be Namrata Ahuja. As Mr. Nair said, Namrata may not be in a position to join us, but yes, we will have her heard from one of our colleagues. Bala will, I think, stand in for her. Namrata is a senior journalist with the Delhi-based Week magazine and has covered national security issues since 2007, China and Pakistan being its major focus. She has also evinced great interest in cybersecurity issues in India and elsewhere. We had her earlier on in September 2010 in the first webinar, which was a curtain raiser on China. And she spoke to us at length about cybersecurity issues, threats and challenges, and how India needs to respond. Today's points which she would like to have spoken to us is to list how the Chinese Communist Party promotes its flawed content and narratives abroad in pursuit of its national security policy, and also how India needs to deal with it, or India will deal with it. Our third speaker today is Professor Dr. Naresh Rao from the Christ University, the Department of Media Studies. Dr. Rao has been a member of the teaching community of Christ University since 1993 and has obtained his PhD in communication from the Bangalore University. He is currently engaged in a major research project entitled Role of Social Media in 2019 Indian General Elections. And another major project which he is undertaking is on new populism and responses in the 21st century. Dr. Rao is passionate about politics, and international relations and debates. I think he contributes regularly, writing and exchanging his views on topical subjects. Dr. Rao's topic for today is media as an instrument of China's state policy. I have a former colleague of mine, Muralidharan Nair, who is the fourth speaker. We wanted to get him on the platform today because I find, and as both my colleagues, Shashi Nair and Commodore Vasan agreed, that Shashi has fluent knowledge of Mandarin language, and he has had served in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Guangzhou, respectively, beginning his career with Singapore. So he's dealt with four postings which were China focused. He speaks the language very well, and he has been schooled in communication and management in Mumbai. He has also done a postgraduate program on business studies in Mumbai. Following his retirement from government, Murali has been active in several spheres of writing and organizing seminars. He's currently a distinguished fellow at Defense Research and Studies and also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. Shashi would like to exchange his experiences of how we dealt with the media in China. So as is having taken these few minutes to introduce our eminent panel, may I now request Mr. Nalapat to kindly take the floor. Thank you, sir. You have 15-20 minutes, and I will not be giving you any notice. So if you feel that you require 5 more minutes, please do signal, then we will take it from there. 15 minutes is ration, 20 minutes is little more. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Pratap. And I think 15 would be quite ample. The only problem is that the subject is basically, I mean, it's not simply media, but I would say so far as China is concerned, I mean, and I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but I'd just like to repeat it once again, that so far as China is concerned, in all practical terms, China means the Communist Party of China. And the Communist Party of China means the leadership core of the Communist Party of China, which of course means substantially the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, who is now Xi Jinping. Now, Xi Jinping, in my view, has been the third transformational leader of the Communist Party after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Mao Zedong's, I mean, if you go to China, for example, and you go outside China, there are different perceptions of Mao. In China, the perception is very different from the perception outside. Mao is regarded as an icon. And I think one of the main reasons is, frankly, that he, by one means or the other, integrated vast territories into the People's Republic of China. I think the only, I mean, if you exclude some of the territories which they claim from us, which unfortunately, they claim from us and which are not at all theirs, then Taiwan remains the one significant exception to Mao's taking over of whether it's Tibet, whether it's Xinjiang, whether it's Outer Mongolia, whether it is Manchuria. All these other territories have been integrated into China, and a process of Sinicization began during that period, which has now progressed to a very considerable extent. So much so that any kind of a decoupling or delinking is going to be infinitely difficult. That was Mao's contribution, basically, building almost from scratch a vast country with a vast territory, and also a political party in power that was, to some extent respected and to a considerable extent feared by the people. Now, this has basically been the reason, this integration of different territories into the historical China has been the reason why Mao is still, considered to be an icon in the Communist Party catheticism in China. Deng Xiaoping, as we all know, went ahead with his economic reforms. and he went ahead with economic reforms that have made a huge difference. And we can see that in the relative rates of growth, for example, of India and China from the time the Deng reform started to let's say 2019 or 2020. I mean, these are statistical facts, and I don't see any need to repeat them here. As far as Xi is concerned, I mean, in my view, Xi is a leader who basically is feeling it quite comfortable in expressing what from day one has been Mao's strategy of essentially creating a situation of, if I may say so, primacy of the Han state over the rest of the world. I mean, I'm not going to use the word civilized and barbarian or whatever, because I mean, these are very imprecise concepts. But I do believe that if you look at Mao, essentially he was a believer in Han exceptionalism, and he was a believer in the Middle Kingdom concept. And therefore, I mean, the argument of many people that what we are seeing now is essentially a red dynasty. I mean, you had different dynasties in China. It was defined by different dynasties, ending, of course, with the Manchus. But now, you have got a red dynasty. And of course, that dynasty also will have a finite lifespan. But it is a dynasty. The only difference being that succession is not done through lineage, but it is done through ideology or through other means, and a lot of which are opaque. So Xi Jinping is quite transparent about that. He's not hidden that fact. And in his dealings with India, with dealings with the rest of the world, I think that transparency has come out. Some people believe it has come out a little too soon, including in China, that possibly he should have waited for 10 or 15 more years before this kind of coming out party took place. But whatever it is, he has been fairly transparent about replacing the United States as the geopolitical pivot. And this Belt and Road Initiative, various other plans, such as, for example, digitalization of currency and planning for a dollar reset. Now, Ambassador Bombale was talking about bringing Russia away from China. That's going to be difficult unless the Americans and the Europeans embrace Russia, which frankly, they had an opportunity to during Bill Clinton's time as president. But Bill Clinton chose instead to try and make Russia a pastoral power, remove its science and technology. And unfortunately, so far as Europe is concerned, I think the Germans and the French in particular are very clear that if the Russians are integrated into Europe, there's no question of Germany having much of a role there or France having much of a role there in terms of the role they have now. So I'm not really certain that either the United States or Europe is going to stand with India in our, if I may say so, isolated efforts to try and nudge the Russians to the right side of history. I personally think it's almost a lost cause. And that's exactly what I've been saying for some time. But of course, I could be wrong. And I certainly hope I'm wrong, because Russian people are amazing people and they have done amazing things. And frankly, they're a strong force multiplier for China, which in terms of India, I would like to say is the primary challenge that we have, the challenge of China. Now, when you look at it this way, the party, in a sense, is the state. And in a sense, the leadership core is the party. And then if you say the party is the state, then the entire state belongs to the party. We are talking about a banking crisis in India, but I mean in China. But the reality of the situation is that the Chinese Communist Party owns the entire territory of the People's Republic of China. So long as there is a credibility in the view that China is a going concern, and perception, of course, drives reality in finance. So long as the perception is there that China, under the Chinese Communist Party, is a going concern, it can manage to get over the shocks. Only if that perception changes and the governance structure is wobbly, will the financial structure then start demonstrating the fault lines that have been pointed out, etc., etc. The media is part of this construct of Han exceptionalism, of Han primacy, and of, if I may say so, a return to the era of the Middle Kingdom with a very much more, if I may say so, a military-oriented posture than in the past. If we have all been to China multiple times. I think one of the things that the Chinese study very, very carefully is the history of the British Empire, the history of the rise of America, the history of the rise of the Spanish, the French, every one of them, and they get lessons from them. I'm not sure those lessons are relevant in the 21st century. They possibly are not, and I think they have drawn some pretty erroneous conclusions from some of them. But those lessons, in large part, the Americans, for example, the military is put front and center, which is why today, in the era of Xi Jinping, you're seeing the Chinese military front and center. And the second thing is, of course, a situation in which what I would consider to be the ancient Jimmy system of China. If you go back in Chinese history, you have what is called a Jimmy system. And the Jimmy system was essentially not a system so much of tributaries or whatever, people coming and giving you tribute, a system in which you retain the ruling structures of territories and you gave them a lot of formal protocol and formal respect. But in effect, those structures did what you want them to do. Now, there are countries in the world today, including some in Asia, who are, in my view, effectively in the Jimmy system, in the sense that they are formally independent. Their formal structures are given every kind of respect, including by the Chinese. Their officials are treated very well. Their heads of state are treated the way heads of state are treated anywhere else. But essentially, they will do what the Chinese regard as best for them. So I think this is basically the geopolitical construct that is now, in the sense, what is being adopted by the Chinese Communist Party core as the ideal construct for dealing with different countries. Now, India is, I think, a problem for them in the sense it's especially in the context of this global move for primacy with the United States. This move for primacy of the United States, I think, began with Deng Xiaoping. And it continued to some extent under Jiang Zemin. It accelerated under Hu Jintao, because don't forget, a lot of the Chinese technology companies, a lot of the Chinese improvement in artificial intelligence, etc., came because of the self-sufficiency drive in technology and advanced computing, other educational things done under Hu Jintao, which have been, in a sense, fastened on to by Xi Jinping. Now, when you look at a situation in which the Americans seem to have finally accepted that, look, China is not going to become a democratic state. I think this was obvious to quite a few of us. I remember long back in the Far Eastern Economic Review, which is now, unfortunately, like many print publications, no longer in the existing, people were talking about economic development and how authoritarianism will be reduced under economic development. I wrote a short essay there in which I said that this economic development is a product of authoritarianism. Because in China, for example, the price of factors of production that go into a product, I mean, that does not determine the final price. The final price determines the cost of the factors of production. And that is because of the absolute control of the state over the factors of production. So in a sense, if what you're talking of economic development, and you're saying that economic development will lead to democracy, well, please wake up and smell the coffee. The democracy, economic development is because of this kind of authoritarianism that is there in China, that they're able to manipulate the prices of factors of production, manipulate various other situations, including transfer of technology by one means or the other from anywhere, including takeover of markets. I mean, across the world, I'm not going to talk about our country, but across the world now, you have very large corporate groups, you have very large public sector, if I may say so, groups that are now become, in effect, conduits for Chinese products to come and demolish local domestic production. If you look at India, several lines of domestic production have been completely taken over by Chinese products. I mean, whether it is, we have all heard about Diwali, and we have all heard about various other, traditional items and traditional crafts. For me, it's always been a worry because many of these craftsmen are in UP, in Bihar, etc. And if they are thrown out of work, well, then the problem is, what else are they going to do? So it has been a serious problem. But then you have, I would say, a limited number of groups that are making a tremendous amount of money by essentially destroying Indian industry and replacing it with Chinese products. And it's not simply the case in India, it's the case all over the world. They are very scientific about it. They go to shopping malls and study which goods are picked up. They go to bazaars, they go to streets, they go and see consumption patterns, and then they find out which can be replicated there and which other groups they need to ensure that they compete against and finally drive out of business here. It's an extremely, if I may say so, orderly and scientific process, and it's a process that it's immense in scope, and it's been happening across the world. Now, finally, I think the world seems to have woken up to that, and the world seems to have talked about decoupling of supply chains, from China, supply chains that were created over time by the Communist Party, right from the time, if I may say so, of Deng Xiaoping. We're talking of Deng Xiaoping as a moderate. We're talking of, let's say, Hu Jintao. But I see a continuum. The only difference is Xi Jinping is a little more open about it because he believes that the Chinese can afford to be more open about their objectives. But the objectives have remained the same for a considerable period of time. Tactics may have changed. The strategy has remained the same. Where does India come in? India comes in essentially because it's the one country where you can pose a challenge to China in terms of, not only in terms of defense, and I think there is enormous respect for the Indian soldier. And let's not forget, Indian soldiers played a very considerable part in the history of China. If you go back even 100 years, you will find that there were a considerable amount of Indian soldiers out there. Indian soldiers have played a considerable part in battlefields across the world, and they have distinguished themselves extremely well. When I use the word soldier, I add the word airman and naval, and of course, the ladies also in the force who are as brave as the men. I'm just using the word soldier as a catch-all concept. But the Chinese know very well the quality of the Indian soldier. That's something to be watchful about. The Chinese know very well the quality of the Indian entrepreneur and the Indian innovative mind. They have gone to Silicon Valley. They have gone to all these different knowledge parks. They have come to Bangalore, and they're right there. And they see the minds that are at work, and they see the capacity of these minds. Well, of course, the advantage that they have, which they feel they have, and they're quite open about it when they discuss it with some people who have known them for a long period of time, is the glorious Indian governance system, which has been borrowed, which is 100, 120, 130, 140 years old. And the colonial construct, which I've been talking about for about 20, 25 years. I'm glad to say more and more people are talking about colonial constructs now. But the way in which so many, things have to go through a bureaucratic situation. And you have so many so-called infractions and breaches of the law in which you can be sent to jail. Now, something, if your chartered accountant goes wrong on some computation, there are 40 different ways in which under 60 different codes or regulations, you can be sent to prison. Forget about a fine. Prison. We have made prison almost mandatory across the system for a wide range of subjects in the quote-unquote battle against corruption. Now, I've always been I'm not saying amused, I'm not saying shocked, but I've always been very clear. The more anti-corruption agencies are set up, the more the manpower allocated to these agencies, the higher the level of corruption becomes in the country, not because of these agencies. They're wonderful people, they're great people, they work very hard, but for some odd, unexplained reason, corruption goes up each time a new anti-corruption drive or anti-corruption agency gets set up in this country. Well, the Chinese are very happy about that, quite frankly. They're not so worried. They're not talking about the corruption aspect, because there's a lot of that in China as well. But they're talking about the fact that you have to go through the bureaucracy, because the reality is that, at least I've seen this now, for example, and for example, Professor Y.S. Rajan, whom you know very well, if some of you can get into to discuss some of his experiences, he may be a good person to basically back up some of what I'm saying. So many young people with innovative ideas have either been removed, destroyed in a sense of their constructs in India because of some obstacle that's been put in the way, or they've gone abroad and they've succeeded very well. It's so easy to go and with some official here, some politician there, and create a problem and go and essentially lock you up in a court case. And we all know that a court case in India will last for generations. Apart from the expense, apart from the time spent, and apart from the obvious reality that there are so many prosecutable penal laws, which is why some of us have been talking in terms of ensuring that you have a system in which there is less of this kind of prosecutorial laws and less of this kind of, what we would say, what we are looking at so far the Chinese are concerned, in a democratic country, I think that kind of system should not be there. Some of us, at a fairly young age, we wrote some pretty, in those days we never thought they were very significant, but we wrote certain things that some of us saw the lockup during the emergency. And I can tell you that's a very great antidote and a great support for anybody who believes in civil liberties. But as I said, the media is only a part of this continuum. Whether it's the military, whether it is the friendship groups, and you have hundreds of them operating all over the country. In fact, you have tens of thousands of friendship groups who are actually one or two or three individuals operating across the world. Whether it is that, whether it is the companies, including the so-called private companies, which are headquartered in China and which are owned beneficially by various interests in China. And the Chinese are, of course, very good at using the Bahamas or all kinds of various other offshore methods and they bought up a whole lot of industries in the zones they're interested in across the world. I think that's the case in India also. This is only part of a continuum. So when you look at media in that context, in China, so far as the system in China is concerned, we can't separate the media from the military. We can't separate the media from the friendship groups. We can't. All of them work in a coordinated manner for the achievement of objectives to the timetable and the tactics mapped out by the leader of the time. As I said, the strategy is the same. The tactics are different. The timetables are different for different leaders. But the strategy is the same. And the strategy is the centrality of China in global supply chains, etc. And now that is what, so far as Chinese media is concerned, that is what is being there. Now, we can point out to the credibility gap between Chinese media and the rest of the world. Well, the question is, what audiences are they reaching? And how are they reaching it? When you talk about Chinese media, I can tell you, you may have a whole lot of media that do not even look like Chinese media. Online media, internet media, possibly even print media. It may be, in a sense, run by some individuals who have got some link somewhere and some link somewhere else. It's very difficult, frankly. So to have a neat differentiation between Chinese media and Chinese controlled media, I would like to say, is a bit difficult. I think, we'll have to spend a considerable amount of time working to this. Why I'm saying all this is, I'm frankly admitting it's an extreme. The Chinese realize that we are the one challenger to their single tiger on the mountain analogy. that we have the potential to be a second tiger on the mountain. They don't believe that we can displace them on the mountain, but we can be the second tiger. And that is something which I would say strategically they simply are not going to accept. And that is why for quite some time, I think they have been looking at vulnerabilities in India. Now, I mean,
Professor Nalapat, 2 more minutes, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to end by saying,
thank you.
That if you look at the CPEC and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and you look at Pakistan, I mean, the name CPEC even coming to that part that goes through the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, albeit in Pakistan occupation, it's clear that the Chinese would like the Pakistan military to control large tracts of our territory. And it's clear why also, because then they can operate much more freely in that situation. So here I'm only like to say that we need to ensure that there is an end to illusions there. When we talk about the media, let's talk about the media in coordination with other states. It's all part of the same process. They go into different audiences, they go into different techniques, but the silver lining in all this is one, as Ambassador Bambawale correctly said, if a system of alliances is fashioned, that this system of alliances can certainly be a nightmare for the Chinese Communist Party. And secondly, if internally we go ahead with reforms, and I think Modi 2.0, we are seeing many more reforms under Modi 1.0. If we go ahead with several reforms that are designed to make this country investor friendly, innovation friendly, and frankly, citizen and civil society friendly, then I think we can challenge this particular tiger on the mountain. They know it. But in the meantime, ladies and gentlemen, we have a fight on our hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nalapat. It was something which I was wanting to hear from you for quite some time, and I'm sure that my colleagues and other participants too would have really enjoyed what you had said, that understood the implications of what was being said. I think it's always good to understand China when you read between the lines and behind the news, where exactly the truth lies. I shall request you to please stay on for the question and answer session at the end of the fourth speaker's take. Then we will have a wider, canvas to paint on. Thank you very much. I now request Bala to take on the portions of Namrata. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, is my screen visible, sir?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, sir. Today, this is Bala Subramanian, Research Officer C3S, presenting on behalf of Ms. Namrata PG. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to Ms. Namrata PG. Despite her constraints, she was able to put up the presentation. She is presenting on the topic Indian perception of Chinese media and misinformation, from borrowing the boat to buying the boat. So to understand how the Chinese media works, it is very pertinent to look at how the Chinese Communist Party promotes its content and narratives abroad. So as a part of its expansion of the global capacity and the presence of the official state media, all of the China's most very prominent state-owned media outlets have its presence internationally across. So the 6 most notable outlets in China are the CGTN, which is a global television network, the CCTV, and of course the English language newspaper, the China Daily, and of course the CCP's mouthpiece, the People's Daily, China Radio International, and 2 news agencies, the Xinhua and Chinese News Service. So all these constellation of bureaus have their presence overseas, and they also do distribute content in multiple languages. For example, in addition to carrying out the CCTV programming in Chinese, the CGTN also broadcasts the services in English, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Russian to every region, not only via satellite, but also cable and IPTV, which is the Internet Protocol Television. Going further, the China Daily is also distributed in locations such as newsstands in New York City, hotels in Hong Kong, Kenya Airways flights, and congressional offices in Washington, D.C. In Africa and Middle East, the Chinese state media have also developed unique publications geared towards local populations, suiting the local content. So going a bit further, While the Chinese state media are also working to break into the new markets and expand their global audiences, the dissemination strategy, which they rely on these outlets, still have a very limited outreach. So as to overcome these challenges, the Chinese government has also developed a considerable aptitude for incorporating official views into foreign programming and publication that reach a wider, more mainstream audience. So as a part of cultivating foreign media that can produce their own favorable content, not all pro-CCP, the Chinese Communist Party propaganda that appears in foreign countries is produced or even co-produced by Chinese media outlet. So the strategy that used is the Chinese diplomats and other officials have gone to great lengths to develop friendly and cordial relations with private media owners, reporters, encouraging them to create their own content that promotes key narratives favored by Beijing. The Chinese diaspora outlets and media owners whose coverage serves as CCP interests are frequently rewarded with advertising, lucrative contract for other enterprises, joint ventures, and even political appointments. So how does it all happen? So if you look at it in a number of documented cases, entities with links to Chinese government have purchased or established their own news outlet to disseminate pro-China or pro-Beijing views. This practice matches what the Annie Mary Brady's 2015 prediction, in which she says the CCP would move from borrowing the boat to buying the boat or purchasing stakes in foreign media enterprises. Incidentally, in 2018, investors believed to have close ties to the CCP-friendly Phoenix TV moved to purchase a radio station in Mexico near the border with the United States, raising suspicions that it would be used to broadcast pro-Beijing content to Chinese speakers in Southern California. But the pattern extends beyond the diaspora media. Over the past decade, the Chinese media outlet, the GB Times, have purchased stakes in or provided content to radio stations in Hungary, Italy, and elsewhere, where they air daily cultural and news programs that portray China in a very positive light. These stations are among at least 8 that the GB Times, founded by Chinese entrepreneur Zhao Yingyang and significantly subsidized by CRI until 2017, operates across Europe, reaching millions of listeners. So the conducting of such disinformation campaigns by China on a global social media platform, the use of such Russian-style disinformation campaign on international social media platforms which are blocked within China has significantly gained prominence over the past year as a relatively new tactic for promoting CCP narratives abroad. Although such phenomena are apparently began as early as mid-2017, previously most evidence of this type of propaganda was observed on domestic platform, according to the Oxford Internet Institute. In 2019, the Chinese government displayed newfound interest in aggressively using Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as a part. And now what we can find is that there is a new modus operandi of misinformation campaign. In a departure from its traditional censorship and propaganda campaign, the narratives being promoted are not necessarily focused on advancing positive views and suppressing negative views of China. For example, in an analysis of China-related Twitter posts disseminated in Serbia between March 9 and April 9 by automated bot accounts, the Digital Forensic Center found that the messages praised China for supplying aid during the COVID pandemic, but the post also amplified criticism of the European Union for supposedly failing to do the same, despite the fact that the European Union bloc actually provided billions of euros in assistance. Ben Nimmo, a director of investigations at Graphica, said the accounts identified by Strick appeared to be linked to a network known as Smamelphage Dragon, which was previously identified promoting attacks on Hong Kong protesters by using hijacked and fake accounts on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. Interestingly, in a September 2019 report, Graphica described Smamelphage Dragon as an active and prolific but ultimately low-impact cross-platform political spam network, whose actions appeared designed to support the Chinese government and discredit its critics both at home as well as abroad. Elsewhere, the disinformation attempts have tried to sow discord within other countries. For example, in Argentina, a Chinese agent hired a local intermediary to approach editors from at least 3 news outlets in early April, according to the Falun Dafa Information Center. The broker also allegedly offered to pay approximately $300 if they published a pre-written article in Spanish that smeared the Falun Gong spiritual group, which is persecuted in China, including by suggesting local citizens who practice Falun Gong could pose a threat to public health in Argentina. All of the approached outlets reportedly rejected the offer. In other cases, the manipulated content shared had no connection to China at all. In a campaign in the United States, reported by the New York Times, text and social media messages amplified by China-linked accounts in mid-March carried false warning about a nationwide lockdown and troop deployments to prevent looting and rioting. The campaign was an apparent attempt to incite public panic and create distrust in the US government. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute documented another recent example in which coordinated campaign by nationalistic Chinese netizens whose precise links to the Chinese state remain uncertain attempted to harm Taiwan's international reputation and its relationship with the United States. A network of 65 Twitter accounts that had previously posted in mainland-style simplified Chinese abruptly switched to traditional Chinese characters, thereby impersonating Taiwanese citizens. They then posted messages expressing apologies to the Ethiopian-born Director General of the World Health Organization, lending false credence to allegations he voiced that racist slurs were directed against him from Taiwan. The March campaign, also in the United States, underscored some of the evolving tactics of China-linked disinformation campaign. While platforms like Facebook and Twitter remain important battlegrounds, recent investigations indicate a shift toward text messages and encrypted messaging applications. Due to their more atomized structures, monitoring and countering disinformation on these channels is more difficult than on Facebook and Twitter. Moving on, a recent report by Recorded Future found that ahead of January 2020 general elections in Taiwan, Chinese content farms used artificial intelligence to generate massive volumes of content to undermine the electoral prospects of incumbent President Tsai Ing-wen and her Democratic Progressive Party. The research group also cited evidence that China-based actors had deployed a tool developed by a Chinese company that enables batch posting and sharing of content across multiple platforms. But such low technology tactics are also being used. Over the past year, numerous reports have emerged of China-linked actors seeking out Chinese-speaking social media influencers with international following, offering to purchase their accounts or pay them to post certain information. The other reports also indicate that this practice is not limited to Chinese speakers, but also extends to individuals like an English-speaking Canadian YouTuber. The much about China-linked overseas disinformation campaign remains unknown. Indeed, the examples above are likely just the tip of the iceberg. Given the visible efforts by Chinese diplomats and state media to shore up the government's reputation and downplay its responsibility for repressive measures in Wuhan that contributed to the global coronavirus outbreak, it seems reasonable to assume that covert Twitter bot campaigns have occurred in additional countries, particularly in Europe. Another popular one, the WeChat social media platform owned by the Chinese company Tencent, is a potentially influential channel for political disinformation and content manipulation with more than 100 million users outside China. A study published this week by Toronto's Citizen Lab found systematic surveillance by posts by users registered abroad, with evidence of scanning for politically sensitive terms. This sphere of activity also poses a challenge for the CCP itself, because once exposed, the disinformation campaign that spread falsehood and sowed division in other societies undermine a key dimension of Beijing's foreign propaganda narrative, one that it has invested heavily in promoting over the past 3 decades that China rise is peaceful, that the regime is benign and shuns any interference in other countries, and that political, economic, and media engagement with a CCP like China is a win-win prospect for all involved. It is difficult to predict whether and how the party will try to reconcile this contradiction. For the time being, the CCP's global disinformation campaign show no sign of abating. Coming to the next question, so how do we tackle the Chinese disinformation campaign? The Australian government recently announced plans to establish the country's first task force devoted to fighting disinformation campaign under the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. The task force has been especially constituted to tackle the Chinese disinformation campaign. Ideally, the need of the hour is India also needs a government regulation around disinformation, and although this hasn't happened yet, the announcement of a government-run disinformation task force is at least one step in the right direction. India needs to regulate campaign finance by foreign companies. It also needs to bring laws on counter-interference and espionage laws and create transparency and disclosure requirements for lobbyists or others acting on behalf of foreign governments and toughen sanctions and enforcement provisions. The world should look at and try to replicate the Taiwanese model, because recently the Taiwan successfully fought off information attacks on its national election from China, an adversary larger by a factor of 23 in gross domestic product, 60 in population size, and 267 in landmass. First, what the Taiwanese did was the Taiwanese government monitored media platforms around the clock and effectively debunked false news with the potential to gain traction. The government often used memes to disseminate the correct information publicly, recognizing that online viral content tends to be short, funny, and easy to understand and share. The government also timed its debunking with a news cycle, releasing correct information well in advance of nightly news so that traditional media would help spread it. The overall idea behind this is to ensure that clarification spread faster and further than false news, so that facts dominate the information space before falsehoods do. Second, in addition to reactively countering fake news, the central government raised public awareness of both general and Chinese propaganda and disinformation through a public health lens. It sought to build a public mindset that fake news is like a virus. Because anyone can catch and spread the virus, everyone should work together to detect and prevent its spread. This framing removed the good-bad binary from false news and thereby curbed its ability to polarize the body politic. What the government moved on is then it focused on education. For example, it drove media literacy truck to rural areas to conduct fake news identification workshop for citizens with less media experience. Third, the Taiwanese government also used legal means to rein in Chinese propaganda. The anti-infiltration law was also adopted to deter Chinese interference in the elections and frame them as a referendum on Chinese penetration into Taiwan. The law states that any person or entity receiving support from overseas hostile forces in donations in an election or referendum, in lobbying, and in disrupting assembly will face imprisonment of up to 5 years and fines up to $335,000. So far, it appears to be having an effect. Master Chain, the only Taiwanese media outlet that had an office in China, immediately criticized the law, closing its Taiwan operations and relocated to Beijing. Separately, Taiwan's National Communication Commission most strictly enforced the island's factual and balanced reporting regulation for television and radio. For example, the CTI TV, a prominent television channel suspected to be under Chinese influence, was fined more than $186,000 in 2019 for broadcasting and disseminating falsehood. Combined with public criticism of their biases, this seems to have pushed outlets with suspected Chinese ties to become relatively more factual and balanced in their reporting, according to Taiwanese journalists. Lastly, let's take a look at some examples of Chinese information campaigns in India. The Chinese favored targets for such psychological ops have primarily been the United States and Taiwan, and recently the Hong Kong protests. The recent tension and violence between India and China in Galwan Valley appears to be bringing Indians in the crosshairs of well-oiled Chinese psyops machinery. The Twitter was flooded with pro-Chinese and China favoring disinformation content during the Galwan clashes. Such online psychological operations target internet users with selective messaging, which include altered facts and disinformation, which then influences the targeted users' emotions and objective reasoning. Several Twitter handles claiming to be from China tweeted content argue that India suffered a massive defeat in Galwan. A couple of Twitter handles also posted videos and said that 10 Indian soldiers were administered a hyperbaric oxygen treatment by China's People Liberation Army, PLA. The tweet also claimed that there was no PLA casualties in the clash with the Indian Army in Galwan Valley. Such tweets from unverified Twitter users received hundreds of retweets and likes. The attached video was also viewed over 100,000 times. Coming to the Chinese apps in India, they have also acted as boosters for Chinese propaganda messages. Many of the most popular apps in India are owned by Chinese companies which appear to follow Chinese censorship law that are intolerant of any criticism of China, even when operating in other countries. WeChat, a popular messaging app owned by China's Tencent, was found censoring political messages posted by Americans and also banning American accounts for discussing events in Hong Kong. Something similar is also happening here in India. Users have pointed out that WeChat had deleted a statement by Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the India-China border situation. The Chinese-owned news aggregation services known to restrict or downrank content critical of China, even for Indian users. The reach of a recent online poll by News 18 on China was also similarly found to be restricted. Recently, Twitter removed 23,750 Twitter accounts along with approximately 150,000 more accounts connected to China for misusing the platform to spread propaganda and misinformation. Twitter is banned in China, so there would be minimal opportunity for the Chinese government to develop and embed troll accounts into local Twitter networks. Instead, China has likely hacked, stolen, or purchased legitimate accounts. Twitter hasn't exactly revealed how it detected the state-sponsored accounts, presumably because this would give other states a how-to guide on circumventing the platform security barrier. But according to a New York Times report, one giveaway is when a user logs into many different accounts from the same web address. The Twitter has also suggested unblocked accounts posting from China may be acting maliciously with government approval. The Indian government recently decided to monitor 2,500 social media accounts which allegedly disseminate Chinese propaganda. The government says most of these social media handles operate from Pakistan. The government claims to have blocked few fake accounts which allegedly peddle disinformation. According to an Economic Times report citing multiple sources, these accounts, which are allegedly active on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, have been traced to Pakistan, Hong Kong, United Kingdom, Russia, and China. The report added that Pakistan topped the list with the most number of social media handles spreading anti-India content. The government has already taken up this contentious issue with the social media companies and have managed to block a few fake accounts which were peddling lies and disinformation. In September 2019, METI, the Ministry of Information and Technology, has asked social media platforms to keep the government in the loop while taking action over such misinformation and anti-India content. Between July to December 2019, Twitter received a total of 782 legal content removal requests from India. In December 2018, Ministry of Information and Technology has proposed amendments to the Information Technology Act with an aim to curb the misuse of social media platform and the spread of fake news. Among other things, the draft proposed that the intermediary will have to deploy technology-based automated tools for proactively identifying and removing or disabling public's access to unlawful information or content. China has intensified its disinformation campaign to tackle the global backlash against the CCP on coronavirus pandemic. To tackle the pandemic, Beijing is both manipulating factual information and spreading disinformation or willfully false information to distract from the origins of the virus, highlight the failures of the US, and promote China as a global leader. Recently, the CCP's propaganda missionary brought on videos of WION channel, the World is One News channel, interviewing the Chinese doctor accusing the CCP of willingly spreading the pandemic. Many handles of Indian intellectual and think tanks were brought down by Twitter after being mass attacked by Chinese accounts. China has long utilized information and disinformation domestically and regions close to the People's Republic such as Taiwan. In recent years, Beijing has expanded its activities globally, increasingly taking from the Russian playbook of stoking division in other countries, sowing public doubt about expertise and spreading rumors. Beijing has cast doubt on whether the virus actually came from China, suggesting without evidence that it could have come from the US military, attacking specific countries and leaders. Chinese information and disinformation campaign have targeted many countries including Australia, France, the United Kingdom, and even India. A report of Alliance for Secure and Democracy noted that the Chinese Communist Party has attempted to tailor its messages while still promoting Beijing as a global leader, a message that will come through even more strongly if China produces the first effective COVID-19 vaccine. Beijing uses large number of fake social media accounts to push its messages. It has increasingly relied on trolls and bots. The Chinese diplomats amplify spin and outright false messages, and big Chinese state media outlets push the government story. US intelligence sources reportedly have found that the Chinese intelligence agent or people linked to them appear to use text messaging and messaging apps to sow panic in the United States about COVID-19. The US officials had not previously noticed Chinese intelligence agents trying to spread disinformation by texting citizens' mobile phones, a strategy that requires significant knowledge of US infrastructure. Meanwhile, Google has revealed it caught Chinese hackers trying to get access to email accounts from the presidential campaign of former US Vice President Joe Biden, possibly to influence the 2020 election. Beijing has spread some COVID-19 rumors, but Chinese leaders appear wary of the path of outright trolling. Doing so could undermine China's simultaneous efforts to portray itself as a responsible global leader. To conclude, the Chinese fake social media accounts spreading disinformation about COVID-19 often appear shoddier than Russian ones and thus easier to expose. To conclude with some of the CCP's method to meet its objective, according to Harvard University Belfer Center, China employs the following methods to meet its objective of propaganda or misinformation. 1. Worsening existing social, political, economic, and generational divides. 2. Exploiting weakness in the informational system. 3. Controlling and absorbing traditional media financially. 4. Using its cyber army. 5. Obfuscating attack sources through technological, commercial, and legal means. And finally, the 6th point, making the attacks partisan so that one side will at worst not condemn them and at best magnify the efforts. With this, I would like to conclude the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bala, for having walked us through the PowerPoint presentation of Namrata. I must compliment her for the brilliant manner by which she has articulated the subject, and especially drawn attention to various developments around the world where Chinese media activities have come to notice, especially sharp notice, and also what are the areas that we need to be concerned, and if we need, how can it be countered. I think what we will do is we will leave. I understand that though she is very much on the webinar, she will be in a position to take on questions at the end of the session. With this, I would like to thank both Bala and Namrata for their contribution. And now may I request Dr. Naresh Rao to kindly take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. And good morning to everyone. I think I have this PowerPoint. Do I have to share it, or will be?
You can share it, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
So I'm sharing it. Is it fine? Yeah.
Okay, okay, great. Okay. So, good morning, everyone, again. Let me start with one very interesting because it's something very personal that I've never mentioned in any other context. But when it comes to media, my first encounter with media happened as a young boy while studying in Bombay. And what happened was, we used to access shortwave radio in the 70s. And shortwave radio was one of the most important ways through which we could get to know about the news from different countries. So we used to tune into Voice of America, then Moscow, Radio Moscow, Deutsche Welle, and Radio Australia, etc. One of the things that hits me now is the fact that there was no access to China, because at that time in the 70s and up to the 80s, China was not on the world scene, and they were not pushing their media as aggressively as they started doing in the 90s onwards. So let me start my presentation now. So my topic today is media as an instrument of China's state policy. So what I'm going to look at is the first slide. Is my understanding of media, and I think every one of us is aware of what media is, and media refers to all means through which we get information and entertainment. So it could be newspapers to social media, etc. Now, media is a very, very important source of information to millions of people around the world, and whoever controls the media does control the thinking of billions of people in the world today. So technology has obviously contributed to the expansion and the growth of media. Like we see now, internet-based media is something that is able to carry messages to anyone around the world. So by using any of the social media like Twitter or Facebook. So from very local, like newspapers used to be very, very local centuries ago, to a global media is what the media has become today. And media is obviously very, very important in the context of any democracy, because we get information on the basis of which we take very vital decisions, including the decision to vote in an election. The next slide, please. Second thing that I'm going to look at is the power of media. So we all, I think, have ample examples of how the media has shown its power over the last century or so. For example, in the Indian context, and when media has been used for nation building, I recollect, one of the things that I've read while doing my masters, and this was to do with how the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, in 1958 invited Sham, Wilbur Sham, who's considered to be, or at least was considered to be at that time, one of the three major communication experts, especially in the field of development communication. He was invited to New Delhi, and on his suggestion, the Indian government decided to start television in 1959 from New Delhi. And television, according to Wilbur Sham, can be used in order to build the nation. That is, you can bring together the different parts of the country together by having a very centralized television network. And that's how, our television network, if you see Doordarshan, has evolved over the time. It's very, very centralized. Then obviously, media is also something which carries advertisements and, information about products, goods, etc., which then help in the economic prosperity. Then it also has the power to bring together people, social cohesion, in the sense that, films, for example, in India have played a huge role in trying to bring about communal harmony and, bridge social distances. Then it also, like I just mentioned, it enables public sphere, which means that, everyone has a right to give their opinion about various issues of common concern. And through this, consensus can be reached, and this enables democracy, participatory democracy in this country. Again, it also is to do with, trying to disseminate popular culture. So Hindi movie industry, for example, is one of the best examples to drive home the point that popular culture in the country, whether it's to do with the dance or the costume, the rituals, etc., all of these things have been disseminated over the years very successfully across the country, and maybe even to other parts of the world. And finally, it's also an instrument of change. Media is a power which can be used to bring about change in the society. So using the media in order to disseminate information, which is very important for change agent, right? So that is something that is also a powerful aspect of media. And in that, I again bring Voice of America as an example, where during the Cold War years, Voice of America was used in order to disseminate information about the West, about democracy, about freedom, etc., to people across the Iron Curtain into Eastern Europe and Soviet Union in particular. So a lot of people, I think, give a lot of credit to stations like Voice of America to having incited the people to overthrow the communist authorities in Eastern Europe and then Soviet Union. Next slide, please. China. So coming to China, I mean, we all should understand that China is a socialist communist country. So socialism is based on the premise that the state is the ultimate authority and everything is subservient to the state. And the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party in this case, is something which has total control over the affairs of the country. And the state, like I think earlier Ambassador Gautam had mentioned, the state in China is similar to the Communist Party of China. So there's no distinction between the two. So the Communist Party has total control, and General Secretary, and this time, I mean, this refers to the president also, Xi Jinping, is the person who has got the ultimate authority in China today. The state is important source of everything in China. So the Communist Party controls everything, including the media. And this is where the power of the media comes into picture, because media is used by the Communist Party in China in order to articulate its position on various aspects for the domestic audience, and increasingly today for a global audience. And next. And this has increased in the recent past since Xi Jinping has taken over in 2012. So media in China, I think already Namrata's presentation gave a lot of insight into how the media is structured in China. Just an overview from 49 to 80. I think we all know that 1949 was a year when the present Communist Party took over and started ruling China by ousting the Nationalist Party. From that time to the early 90s, early 1980s, there was only state-run media outlets. So there was no concept of any independent media organization in mainland China. So media was less regulated in certain times. Like, for example, in the 80s, after Deng Xiaoping took over, there was a little bit of freedom given to the media, but suddenly in 89, during the Tiananmen Square incident, the media clampdown was severe, and the restrictions were increased on the media within China. Then again, during the 90s or late 90s, under Jiang Zemin's presidency, it was relaxed a little bit. But with the coming in of internet in the 2000s, it again reverted back to having a huge control over the media in the present context. So China, according to Press Freedom Index, is ranked 177 out of 180 countries, almost at the bottom. So it reflects the kind of Western understanding of how media is totally controlled in communist China. There's one very interesting information, that is 17 journalists had been jailed in 2019. This is something which is in addition to the huge amount of censorship and regulation that is in place in China. It is also a huge kind of a strategy that is used in China in order to intimidate the journalists to the official line. Even though the constitution of any communist country like former Soviet Union or the present day China talks about press freedom and freedom of the press, etc., there is a kind of practice where even though on paper there is huge freedom given to the press or to the media in general, they cannot take on. I mean, they cannot criticize the Communist Party, its programs and policies, etc. And the sovereignty and integrity of China is off limits for any criticism. This is something that is strictly implemented, and this is in the form. I mean, this has led to a huge self-censorship among the media professionals, including journalists in China. Next slide, please. Media and state policy. So coming to the topic that I've been given today, how in China media is used as an instrument of state policy. So media control is basically to further the state policy. So whenever there is a change in the state policy in China, the media is used in order to articulate that change and implement that both within the country and outside of the country. So traditional media, obviously newspapers, radio and television are always used. But today there is huge reliance on new media, which is in the form of both online publications, online television, etc., but also social media. So there's a very interesting information that was presented in the previous presentation of Namrata, where there was a mention that China is increasingly using Facebook, Twitter, and even YouTube, which are all banned in China, but they're using it to reach out to audiences around the world. So there is an increased reliance on Facebook and Twitter, especially, in order to both spread the Chinese propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, and also what we call as Chinese story to the world outside. So even now, much of the media is state-owned, but in some cases they are independent, but again controlled media. So these are the main aspects of Chinese media today. China Daily, which is a newspaper, CGATN, which is both the television network, China Global Television Network. Also, it is available online. And Xinhua News Agency, which is the news agency from which much of the material is taken for both domestic and international media content. So this is how the media and state policy go together. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things that everyone, I think, has also understood is the globalization is when China wanted to come out and showcase both its own achievements, but also they wanted to assert their economic and political power, which is an automatic, kind of a effect of the growth that had taken place in China during the 90s and 2000s. So the last 2 or 3 decades, Chinese economic growth has been exceptional, and this has led to Chinese media becoming very assertive, especially outside of China. So the parallel narrative is something that people talk about, and China is using all the means to try and provide an alternative narrative to what is usually circulated through the traditional international media organizations like BBC, CNN, etc. They have a particular narrative about China, but China wants to now counter that with a parallel narrative using its own media, but also friendly media in various countries, like it was mentioned in the previous presentation. So state against this plays a very pivotal role in the media policy, how media is going to work in different contexts. Like, for example, I think in the recent cases, whether it was the border standoff between India and China, or in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, in both these cases, you can see the role that media played in furthering the state policy on these issues. So Chinese economic miracle and the consequent decline in the American power worldwide in the last 1 decade has led to China asserting itself on the world scene. So they are also combating negative discourse in the mainstream international media through various schemes. I mean, like buying media space, which is a very simple thing to do, to buying media itself in various countries, establishing alternative media in these countries. Like, for example, the Chinese production company, content production company, video production company, is there in Washington, D.C. and in Nairobi, Kenya. So these supply content to not only Chinese media, but also to international media, which is both BBC, CNN, all of them take content from the Chinese production company. So this is a way through which the negative discourse is sought to be overcome and provide a very positive spin on China. So that is how the China story is now being portrayed through the various media channels. Next slide, please. Okay, so coming to the present decade, to the recent past, like last 6 to 8 years, Xi Jinping has really asserted himself, and his strategy has been very clear as to use every means in order to put China at the top, right? So media is obviously the most important way through which the communication will happen about China and about China's perspective on various issues around the world. So he has increased the funding of state-owned media. So it has led to the global expansion of media in the last 6 years. and it's also able to compete with international media conglomerates like I said, BBC, CNN, etc., and Al Jazeera and other like RT of Russia. So it's competing with these organizations on the global.
Excuse me, Dr. Rao. Can we say another 3 minutes? We're running behind time.
Yeah, I have just one more slide. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
thank you.
yeah, thank you. See that China's voice is heard internationally. So their objective is very, very clear that China wants to have a say directly in anything that happens around the world which has an impact on China. So the Belt and Road Initiative that was started in 2015 is also a way through which China is trying to build not only roads and other infrastructure, but also communication infrastructure, which can then help China to further its media around the world. So especially in Asia, Europe, and Africa. Next slide, please. So I just have a last couple of things, and one is the example of China's influencing Indian media. So Chinese embassy came out with a very interesting, I think, Twitter, which basically asked Indian media to adhere to the One China policy, which is something that is the official Indian accepted line. Because there was quite a few editorials that came out in the newspapers. Obviously, Taiwan's National Day was coming up in October 10th, I think. And as a run-up to that, Taiwan, I think, had invested in these ads. So to counter that, the Chinese took a proactive step and tried to intimidate the Indian media, especially the news media, in order to see that they don't give importance to Taiwan. Then the Doklam standoff, the May-June issue, where Indian media was targeted, and there was also an attempt to buy influence with Indian media so that the Chinese point of view was given more prominence in India. So there was also this Chinese ambassador interview on CNBC that was criticized because it gave a free hand to the Chinese ambassador to put across the Chinese point of view without being asked any tough questions on in the interview. Okay, so I'm not sure when the mic was turned off, but the whole point is that China uses media in order to both counter the anti-Chinese, what they perceive as anti-Chinese content in media, but also to provide an alternative narrative, which is a Chinese version of what they perceive to be the right way of looking at things around the world, whether it is the India-China standoff in Galwan region or the coronavirus pandemic, etc. So that's my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rao. I think you covered the contemporary ground in a very clear and precise fashion. And it is important that we need to understand what are the milestones that we have covered in the past, what is happening now, and how do we move ahead. I think it's both educative and instructive, especially for those who are taking up the study of China, either in the universities or in higher institutions of education. Thank you once again. I will now, for dearth of time, request you to be with us for the question answer session. And now I will ask Mr. Muralidharan Nair to come on stage and to share with us his experience. As I had mentioned, I would request you to keep it short, sweet, and tidy so that we are well within time and we don't deny the succeeding panels their share of the screen time. Thank you very much, Dr. Rao, and over to Mr. Nair.
Am I audible now? Hello? Hello?
You're audible, Murali. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Honorable Chairman, sir, Dr. Shashi Nair, Ambassador Gamba Bembawale, if he's still with us, a warm, respected panelist. Warm greetings from a cold morning. I think it's going to be noon now from Delhi. I'm sorry I embarrassed the organizers by crashing into this session. In fact, I don't know whether I will be able to um, give my a little experiences and a few observations based on my encounters. I would say of the fifth kind with some journalists during my tenure as a consul in Shanghai and Guangzhou. I was looking after the culture and information divisions in these places. Culture and info includes media in the Ministry of External Affairs jargon. I landed up in Shanghai along with a pioneer team that opened the consulate there in 1994. So I will cut short all these, backgrounders and straight come to the point to save the time. One of the first diplomatic baggage, that's a C category bag containing printed material we received was, full of material meant for publishing in local media during the Independence Day that was to fall on August 15, as we all know. But getting an appointment with an editor or an editor of an international page in a Chinese newspaper was an Herculean task. They had their FAO, Foreign Affairs Office, in each newspaper. They also had a party unit. So once we are asked for an appointment, and India was new to them, the memories of 1962 was still fresh in the minds of the Chinese journalists, may not be the ordinary people. So it was a Herculean task, but finally we managed to get some appointments. And I took permission of my consul general, selected a few articles, and he wished me well, but I could sense that he was holding up something. And I went to these journalists, presented them with our, these papers which the ministry had sent, mostly paper clippings and some good articles on Indian culture and other things. But as can be expected, in fact, none of the articles were published during the Republic Day. Then the Consul General, a veteran of China, told me that it's not easy to do these things in China, so you have to be patient. But believe me, I was not disappointed. I could expect this to happen to a certain extent. In those days, the Chinese newspapers were always, every day there was a negative article on India, a train crash or a bus accident, a bus falling into a river, fire, floods, a bridge collapse and all. Chinese media was not making up these stories. It was all happening, especially with the trains and all, with the archaic signaling system we had. Accidents were a routine matter there. So getting a positive article was a little difficult. But when I went to Guangzhou later on, after a decade later, things were different. Interestingly, every journalist in Guangzhou feels that he is a liberal. And to a certain extent, it's true also. So getting an appointment in Guangzhou was easy, relatively easy, maybe because of the geography, because it's in southern China. As I said, people are a little more liberal than in Shanghai. And maybe the times, 10 years made a lot of difference in China. Maybe there were no much political reforms during those 10 years, but then things had definitely changed. So before that, I was in Hong Kong. I had this additional charge of information, where meeting a journalist was no issue, as we all know. But coming back to my Shanghai experience, then what we did was we removed all those, controversial, according to the Chinese, subjects, and we picked up stories about Miss World, Aishwarya Rai winning Miss World, then another young beautiful girl winning the Miss Universe, Miss Asia Pacific. Then the Millennium Bug, India discussing about taming the Millennium Bug. Then the India space program, particularly the Chinese were very, very interested in the low Earth orbit satellites at that time. Then things like Udaipur Park, then above all Bollywood. So we could finally succeed in publishing a few articles in during the in Republic Day, which fell in January. So this was all restricted to, tucked away in the international pages. But then I was happy that every Chinese is interested in international affairs. So definitely people would have seen them. And later on also, even I always made it a point to scan the Chinese newspapers for its coverage of India. It helped me in so many ways in knowing the editor's mind, what the people wanted to read about India. So things were smooth by the time I moved into Guangzhou. But then suddenly, an Indian prime minister visits the US, or a Japanese foreign minister visiting India, or India, bringing in rules that the mobile phone should have that 16-digit IMEI number. Then the Chinese media projected these things as an attack on the Chinese, that India is going against the wishes of the Chinese. They never bothered about the Indian interest in these matters. So this was a routine thing. In fact, the Chinese media went hyper in those days, especially when India and Japan, or India and US try to come together on certain matters. And it helped me in scanning this media of Indian coverage, helped me in selecting a few journalists for outreach programs of the Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Tourism. And I found that understanding of India among some of the journalists who have not worked abroad, they might have visited foreign countries, was abysmal in some cases. Before they come on outreach program, we organize a lunch where all the journalists meet, we hand them over our visas, tell them what can be expected in India during the meetings, because the programs are not final in India till the last moment, and the general do's and don'ts when visiting India and all. So this particular senior editor asked me, will he be required to carry toothpicks to India, or will the Indian hotel provide him with a toothbrush? These were the types of questions asked. So I could understand that their general awareness about India was very poor. But there was this young lady journalist who was editing the international page of a leading newspaper with over 1 million copies sold every day. And Pranab Mukherjee was the foreign minister. And normally during such visits, they have a tea session with the Minister of External Affairs, or if he's away, somebody else equally senior. And his office people were serving tea and asking each journalist whether would you like to have tea or coffee. And this was an inflection point for this journalist, who couldn't imagine that a Chinese minister will, the person who is serving tea will ask whether she wants coffee or tea in front of the minister, because no one speaks in front of the minister in China. And there was this young lady from Southwest China who visited, normally after visiting India on outreach program, they all extend their stay for a few days, and visited Varanasi. This was well before 2014. And she liked it so much, she extended her stay and wrote at least 20 articles on Indian culture. That was a major thing for us who were in China. I don't say people or journalists who visited India all got converted in their first or second visit, but definitely it mellowed down them. They empathized with what was happening in India, and the type of negative reportage of India came down very much. Uh, then why these newspapers are totally anti-India at times is because it's all politics, as we all know, and all the newspapers are either controlled, if not owned by the Communist Party or the government. Even the private news channels or newspapers, so-called private news, are funded by state-owned enterprises owned by the party or the government. So we can understand that the media is playing along with the government in such matters. I remember the incident of ANI. ANI wanted.
Excuse me, Murali, you have
Yes,
3
sir.
minutes more, please.
Okay, sir. Yeah, ANI wanted to have tie-ups with exchanging of news feeds with Chinese TV stations. We tried our level best. Some of them were very happy to go along with us, but then the approvals never came from the Communist Party, which I understand is that even if the political leadership or officials at the top level agree to improve relations with India, in my view, I think the officials at the implementation level are not yet ready to have that sort of cordial relations with India. And Ambassador also mentioned about the global times. I think it's the way the Communist Party intimidates people by saber rattling. Unfortunately, our Indian media, they never look for, if they need English newspapers to get inputs from China, they can even have access China Daily, or even People's Daily has an online edition in English, but they always listen to or quote Global Times, which is only a sounding box in my view. If you went by Global Times, definitely there would have been many wars between India and China during the past. So in my view, just I will finish with one point. I am skipping a lot of points I had jotted down. I find that the Chinese leader will never open in front of the media, criticize a country. That is left to officials. They want to send a message, even for domestic audiences. They leave it to the academics, think tankers, retired officials, retired army men, and officers will open their mouth, or that is criticizing somebody, some other country, only when it's absolutely necessary. So allowing these NGOs and think tankers to give their views helps the government to disown their view, but the message would have been sent by that time, or they can step back after some time. So definitely that's a message for the Indian leaders also. Even our senior ministers and senior officials get carried away when they see a few TV cameras. I think that sort of comments should be left to trained spokespersons and the ministers or higher level officials to comment on only when it's required. I am saying this in the China context, and this is a route the Chinese have been taking all these years. So I don't know whether I have disappointed after listening to these wonderful presentations by Dr. Nalapat, Ambassador Nagawala, Dr. Rao, and all. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Murali. I think you were in parts of China where different dialects were spoken. I think Canton or Guangzhou has its own dialect. I think when you went to Shanghai, you spoke in another dialect. I think we don't know how to make how to make up for this different styles of languages used in Chinese media. That I think we will be able to hear from Mr. Adlaka sometime subsequently in one of our panels. I request him to stay on and enlighten us on this subject. I would now ask Bala to take up the Q&A, please, before that allow me to make the vote of thanks. Bala, over to you.
Thank you, sir. I'm not able to find any questions to be posed as a part of this session, sir. May I now request you to present the vote of thanks, please, sir?
Thank you very much. I think I enjoyed sitting through this panel. It was both my privilege and honor to be associated as the moderator for this panel. We had 4 different professionals who exchanged and interacted with us with their views. One was Muralidharan, who was in China, who has seen this at the grassroots level, what media is and how the media reacts to India. And that was a very, very important experience he shared with us. Then we had Dr. Naresh Rao, who gave us a very interesting insight into the Chinese media policies and how they create an image for China, at the same time ensuring that the Chinese image is not hurt in the eyes of its own people, or prevent adversarial comments on China and its leadership, or the Communist Party and its leadership. Namrata's PowerPoint was, in my view, to me, very, very interesting, as she has updated us on the latest developments, and also talks about the burgeoning powers of the Chinese Communist Party and the instruments that it has used in proliferating its interests overseas, at the same time protecting itself. And it also gives us a lot of insight as to what we ought to be doing, or what we need to be doing at the level of the government, as well as at the level of the corporate world. In today's context, I think there is a lot that can be done, and that lot can be disseminated on a regular basis. Last but not least, I must say that Professor Nalapat's presentation of the facts about the Chinese Communist Party and how it's graduated over the 3 major periods in its life, and what it means in the next many, many years is very important for us. And I see him daily on TV and his views. I think it's very, very important that we understand where he is coming from and what is his exact contribution to the subject. And always have felt that one of my interactions with my colleague on the issue of China and India, I think India needs to be doubly more prepared to deal with the Xi Jinping era, because it's an era which has got no timelines. We don't know when he's going to demit office, and if he is going to be in power for a long period of time. So there are more milestones that we have to look at very, very closely. With these words, I would like to thank Professor Nalapat, Namrata Ahuja, Dr. Naresh Rao, and Muralidharan Nair for their contribution